The first thing Sergeant Dara Voss noticed when she came to was that the sky was the wrong color. Not wrong like a storm wrong. Wrong, like something fundamental had shifted while she was unconscious. Like someone had quietly repainted the universe and forgotten to tell her. The color was a deep, almost suffocating amber, threaded through with clouds that moved too slowly. And the air tasted of iron and wet stone and something she didn't have a word for, something old. She was lying on her back. Her helmet was cracked along the left side. Data pack was fused to the ground below her. The housing warped and split open, every indicator light dark except one, a faint red pulse, slow as a dying heartbeat. She sat up. The landscape in front of her was not the Venlari Station orbital platform, where she'd been standing 30 seconds ago. It was a valley, a wide red rock valley with flat-topped mesas rising on either side, and a river cutting through the middle, running muddy and brown and fast. There were trees unlike anything she had catalogued, heavy-limbed, barrel-trunked, with leaves the size of her torso. There were sounds she couldn't place. Low rumbles, distant percussive impacts, something vaguely animal and large moving through the scrub to her left. She checked her sidearm, present. She checked her knife, present. She checked her comms, dead. Well, Dara said to no one in particular, in the way soldiers say things when the situation is objectively bad, and humor is the only language left. That's new. Behind her, something moved. She spun, weapon raised. It was a boy. No more than 11 or 12 standard years, small for his age, with dark hair and wide eyes that were currently aimed directly at the barrel of her sidearm. He was wearing clothes she recognized in the vague way you recognize a foreign language. The structure was there. The intention was legible, but the specifics were strange. No synth fiber, no wiring. Everything appeared to be natural material, leather, woven plant fiber, something she was fairly certain was animal hide. He was also barefoot, which in a rocky valley full of unknown fauna struck her as inadvisable. He had in his hands what appeared to be a homemade instrument of some kind. Lots of wire. Power cell she recognized as human-made, older manufacture, heavily modified. Casing built from scavenged alloy panels and held together with actual physical fasteners. She lowered her weapon. "You built that," she said, nodding at the device. The boy blinked. Then he held it up. And despite everything, despite the wrong-colored sky and the fused data pack and the total absence of any recognizable landmark, he looked proud. "It's a temporal displacement calibrator," he said. "Well, the Mark III version. The Mark II is what got you here." Dara stared at him for a long moment. "The Mark II got me here," she repeated. Shh. There was a resonance error. Quadrupotent array inverted. That's the technical term. The quadrupotent array. I can explain it if you want. And instead of pushing forward like it was supposed to, it pulled backward. Sideways. It's complicated." He paused. "I'm really sorry." This, she would think later, was how it always went with humans. The ones who broke things were always genuinely, really sorry. It was almost never malice. It was almost always a 12-year-old with a wire and a dream and an inverted quadrupotent array. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elroy," he said. "Elroy Voss." She stared at him. He stared back. She looked at his face the way you look at a stranger's face when something familiar is trying to surface, and found it. The nose, the jaw, the particular set of the eyes. She had looked at that face in mirrors for 38 years. She had watched it age, had watched it harden and soften and harden again. "Voss," she said quietly. "Dad, Sergeant Jordan Voss." The boy said. She holstered her weapon. Her throat felt strange. "Something like that," she said. The valley Elroy called home was not primitive in the way she'd initially assumed. That was the first recalibration. From the air. She had no way to get to the air, but from the ridge above the valley, she could see the settlement clearly. It looked like something assembled from the wrong materials for the right purpose. The buildings were stone and timber and packed earth, but they were sound. The water system used gravity and ceramic pipe. The power grid was small and manual and entirely fossil fuel-based, which she noted and filed under problems to address later, but it functioned. People knew things. They simply knew them in a different key. The second recalibration came when she met Jordan. He was standing in the doorway of what Elroy called home. A low stone structure with a good roof and a vegetable garden out front. that was losing a buzz underground. And he was staring at her the way men stare at something that shouldn't be real. His hair was shorter than she'd ever cut hers. His hands were working man's hands, the knuckles scarred, the fingers thickened. He was wearing the same nothing synth, everything real clothing as his son, and he had a smear of something dark across his cheek that she recognized as axle grease. He'd been fixing something. Of course he'd been fixing something. Sergeant Daravas, he said. His voice was the same. That, out of everything, surprised her most. You know who I am, she said. It wasn't a question. Elroy described you. When he came to get me, he paused. Also, I have a mirror. She looked at him. He looked at her. Somewhere in the 38 years between them, her 38 and his, however many, this timeline's reckoning, something had branched. She had gone one way, and he had gone another. She was a sergeant in the Terran Expeditionary Corps, with a cracked helmet and a fused data pack, and a weapon she hadn't fired in anger in 11 months. He was a man who grew vegetables and fixed things and had an 11-year-old boy who built time machines in his spare time. The alien fleet, she said. The Venlari. You know about them. We know about them. He said it flat and steady. They've been in the outer belt for 4 months. Our sensors see them. They don't come closer. They just watch. They're waiting, she said. What? For you to show them something worth taking. She moved past him into the house. Show me your sensors. This was the world she'd fallen into. Pre-contact, pre-fleet, pre-any of the institutional structures that in her own timeline had taken 60 years and 2 failed wars to build. Here they were still in the window. The narrow, brutally finite window she knew from the history she'd studied. Where it was still possible to do it right. Where the choices hadn't hardened yet. Where the shape of the next 200 years was still wet clay. The Venlari were not, Dara had come to believe, evil in the way stories needed villains to be evil. They were not cruel for sport. They did not hate. What they felt about the species they encountered was closer to the way a sophisticated organism feels about a resource. A kind of cool, assessing interest, and then a decision. You were either viable, complex enough to be worth incorporating, adapting, absorbing, or you were not. If you were not, the calculation was simple. They had made that calculation about 11 other species in the last 4 centuries. 9 of those species were gone. What made the difference in the 2 that weren't was something the Venlari had never encountered before. And still, as far as Dars's intelligence suggested, did not fully understand. Stubbornness. Not tactical stubbornness. Not the calculated refusal to concede ground, but the deep, structural, apparently irrational human commitment to remaining themselves under pressure. Refusal to be solved. The insistence on complexity when simplicity would have been easier. The habit of making things harder than they needed to be. And then, impossibly, finding a way through anyway. The Venlari understood power. They understood strategy. They understood material civilization and technology, and the mechanics of conflict. They did not understand a species that would build a time machine in a valley in the middle of nowhere. For no reason except curiosities. Then, look at the person it accidentally produced and say, with genuine apology, I'm really sorry. Jordan's sensor array was better than she'd expected. He'd built itself over 2 years, from salvage and ingenuity and a working knowledge of electromagnetic physics that he'd apparently developed by necessity rather than training. It was not elegant. It was the opposite of elegant. It was the kind of thing you built when you had no choice and no resources, and you needed it to work anyway. And it worked. She sat with it for 3 hours. He sat with her, saying nothing, bringing coffee, actual ground coffee, not synth, which she hadn't tasted in years, and which hit her nervous system like a small, warm explosion, and letting her work. You know what they're waiting for, she said finally. Tell me. They're waiting for you to panic. They've done this 43 times in the last century. Different systems, different species. They sit out beyond the sensor range of whatever passes for your long-distance awareness. They let you know they're there, and then they wait. Because panic is information. Panic tells them your social cohesion threshold, your institutional resilience, how fast your cooperative structures collapse under stress. She pointed at one of the sensor returns. That cluster, the wide formation, slow orbit, that's their assessment array. They're not watching for military response. They're watching for how you talk to each other. Jordan was quiet for a moment. That's frightening, he said. Yes, but you're here, he said, and your timeline exists. Means someone figured it out. Someone did. She turned to look at him. Problem is that in my timeline, we figured it out after the first war, which means a lot of people died first. She looked back at the sensors. I'd rather not repeat that part. Elroy's Mark III calibrator was, by his own estimate, approximately 40% functional. The remaining 60% was represented schematic drawn on the back of a flour sack in what appeared to be charcoal, annotated with the dense, slightly feverish notation of a child who had taught himself physics from first principles, and was not entirely certain his notation was standard. Core problem, Elroy explained, spreading the schematic on the table with the gravity of a general presenting a battle plan, is the quadrapotent inversion. Correct it. I need a resonance anchor, something that's already been through the field, something that carries temporal imprint from the displacement event, to give the array a fixed point to calibrate against. My data pack, Dara said. Data pack, he confirmed. If we can extract the field signature from the fused housing, the housing's fused. I know. He didn't seem deterred. This was, she was realizing, a defining characteristic. But the signature is in the crystal array inside. And the crystal array is separate from the housing. I just need a way to get at it without destroying the signature in the process. She looked at the data pack, which means no heat, no electromagnetic pulse, no mechanical impact to the interior. Right, he waited. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, your father has an ultrasonic cleaning rig in the workshop. I saw it. Elroy's face did the thing faces do when a problem shifts from impossible to merely very difficult. A fractional brightening, like a light coming on in a distant room. That would work, he said slowly. If we modulate the frequency correctly, we could separate the housing without. Yeah, that would work. He paused. How did you know he had an ultrasonic rig? Because I would have one, she said. Fixes things. People who fix things have ultrasonic rigs. The workshop was the best room in the house. She recognized this the moment she walked into it, recognized it with the specific recognition of a person looking at a version of something they know well rendered in an unfamiliar medium. The tools were different. The materials were different. The power source was different. The organization, the deep, ingrained logic of it, the way everything had its place, not because someone had decreed it, but because it made the work easier. That was the same. Jordan was already there when they came in. He was reassembling something mechanical, moving with the careful economy of a person who has learned that haste costs more time than it saves. He looked up when they entered, read the purpose in their faces, and without a word moved to give them access to the bench. Phasonic rig, Dara said. For the data pack housing, he nodded. He found the rig. Built, she noted, from components that had no business being combined this way, and yet were. And set it up without being asked how. He had, of course, already worked out what they needed. He had worked it out 3 days ago, probably, and had been waiting for her to arrive at the same conclusion. This, she thought, watching him calibrate the rig with his scarred hands moving steadily and without hesitation, was the thing the Venlari could not model. Not the technology. The Venlari had technology that would make everything in this room look like stone tools. Not the intelligence, not even the stubbornness, exactly. It was the accumulation of small competencies in service of each other. Who built the sensor array because someone needed to. The son who built the time machine because he wanted to understand. The woman who fell out of the future, and the man who had gone a different way, and the boy who had his mother's nose and his father's hands and looked at an impossible problem and said quietly, that would work. The Venlari could not model love as a structural element of civilization. This was their blind spot. They had assessed it as sentiment, not as a signal, a biological artifact with no tactical relevance. They had been wrong about this for 400 years. And in Dara's timeline, they had been wrong about it, in ways that had cost them dearly. And they had never quite understood why. She was thinking about this when the fleet moved. Jordan saw it first. He was at the sensor array when the return signatures shifted, the slow wide orbit breaking, the formation compressing, the vectors pointing inward, And he said nothing for 3 full seconds. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of someone who has known bad news was coming and is surprised, despite everything, that it is actually here. They're moving, he said. Dara was at the array in 4 steps. She looked at the returns and ran the calculation. And it came out the same way it always came out in these situations, which was badly. The Venlari assessment phase had ended. They had seen what they needed to see. The next phase, she knew it from the historical record, from the briefings she'd sat through in her own timeline, from the 2 times she'd survived it in person, was called, in Venlari tactical doctrine, the expression. It was not an attack exactly. It was more like a statement, a very large, very definitive statement, delivered at sufficient velocity that the recipients generally did not have time to disagree. How long? Jordan asked. 16 hours, she said. Maybe 20. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what did your timeline do? We panicked, she said. And then, after a lot of people died, we stopped panicking. And we did something they didn't understand, and that was enough. What did you do? She looked at him. She looked at Elroy, who had come in quietly and was standing by the door, holding his Mark III calibrator, listening with the complete attention of a child who understands that the adults are doing something important. She looked at Jordan's hands, the sensor array, the map of the valley with the settlement marked in pencil, the coffee cups, the axle grease still on his cheek. We introduced ourselves, she said. The valley had 3,000 people in it. The broader region, networked loosely through old-fashioned radio communication, Jordan's sensor data, and what appeared to be an extremely efficient rumor infrastructure, had perhaps 30,000. None of them had military resources worth discussing. They had small arms, a few vehicles, the sensor array, and whatever Elroy's calibrator might do once it was fully functional. What they had in larger quantity was a quality Dara had stopped being able to describe but in professional terms years ago. She used the word stubborn when she briefed people, because stubborn was a word that fit in a briefing. The word she thought of, the honest one, was ornery. They were ornery in the specific way that humans in difficult situations became ornery. Not angry, not defiant, not even particularly afraid. Just deeply, constitutionally disinclined to accept someone else's definition of what was possible. She told them everything. Not a version of everything. Everything. The Venlari, the assessment, the 16 hours. The history she'd come from. The 2 wars. The 60 years of building something out of the wreckage. She stood in the square, in the center of the settlement, in the amber light of the wrong-colored afternoon. And she told them the truth, which was that they were about to be evaluated, and the evaluation was existential, and the only thing she knew for certain about how to pass it was, don't be what they expect you to be. They listened. There was the usual arc of response to genuinely terrible news. The silence, the scattered sound of people processing, the beginning of voices, the voices finding their register. There was fear. There was a lot of fear, and she did not try to talk them out of it. Because fear was appropriate, and the people who told you not to be afraid were usually either lying or didn't understand the situation. But there was also something else. She watched it move through the crowd the way weather moves through a landscape. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. Kind of recognition. As if the species had been waiting its entire history for someone to tell it. This is the real thing. This is the actual stakes. This is the moment that matters. And the species' response was, well, it was various. It was arguing and planning. And 2 people she didn't know, starting an extremely heated discussion about the best approach to the sensor array's eastern coverage gap. It was a woman in her 60s asking very specific and technically informed questions about Venlari hull composition. It was a teenager who showed up at the sensor array with a notebook, started asking Jordan how it worked, because she wanted to build another one. It was Elroy, sitting cross-legged in the corner of the workshop, surrounded by the components of his Mark III calibrator, working by lamplight with the focus of a monk and the particular quality of stillness that meant he had solved something. Hey, he said, not looking up. She stood over him. Hey, I got the field signature out of the data pack. She looked. He had somehow separated the crystal array from the fused housing, using the ultrasonic rig, and a technique she did not recognize and suspected he had invented in the last 3 hours. Crystal was in a containment cradle he'd built from the modified power cell casing and 2 bolts. The field signature, she could see it pulsing faintly in the crystal lattice, a faint blue irregularity in the material structure, exactly what she'd hoped was there. Was intact, she said. It won't get you back, he said. Not alone. The temporal anchor only gives me the calibration point. Displacement itself, I'd need a resonance source. Something with enough temporal energy to push the field. The Venlari ships, she said. Shh. He looked up at her. He was 12 years old, and he had spent 3 weeks on a problem and solved it, and he was now being asked to solve a much larger problem in 14 hours. And his expression was not daunted. It was interested. The drive systems? The Venlari use a fold drive. It doesn't fold space. It displaces the vessel's temporal position by a fraction of a second to generate apparent velocity. Field emissions are quadrupotent, he said, very slowly. Yes. So if I could get a receiver near their leading ship, something to capture the fold drive emissions, you'd have more than enough resonance to push the calibration field. Could use the temporal displacement to correct the inverted array. He stared at nothing for a moment. His eyes did the thing eyes do when a calculation is running. Not quite focused, not quite unfocused, looking at something internal and invisible. Then he said, that would bring the whole fleet forward in time. A few seconds, she said, maybe less. Just enough to create the phase differential. But they'd know we did it. Yes. They'd know that we built something in a valley with no advanced manufacturing, and know we'd have used their own drive system against them. Their own fold technology. He paused. That would mean we understood it. That's the point, she said. Another pause. Longer. They'd know we couldn't have understood it, he said slowly. Not without. And unless someone from the future told us. Not unless we had help. Yes. Which means they'd know someone from the future came back. Yes. Which means they'd know the future exists. He looked at her. Which means we survive, she said nothing. That's the move, Elroy said. He said it quietly. Not triumphant, not even particularly surprised. He said it the way you say something when you've been working toward it for a while, and it has finally arrived. If they know we survive, if the evidence proves we survive, then their assessment changes. They're not evaluating whether we're viable. They already know we're viable. They're evaluating something else. Whether we're worth knowing, Dara said. He thought about this for a long time, the way 12-year-olds think about things when they are the kind of 12-year-old who thinks about things properly. Not skimming, not rushing, actually sitting with it. Then he went back to work. She left him there. She went to find Jordan. He was at the sensor array, tracking the fleet's inbound vectors with the practiced attention of a man who had spent months watching the sky and was now watching it in a different key. He had a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and he had not touched it in some time. She stood next to him. She didn't say anything for a while. He'll do it, Jordan said. Not a question. He already has the architecture, she said. He needs a relay point. Something to position in the fleet's approach corridor to capture the fold drive emissions. I can build that. I know. He turned to look at her. The sensor returns cast a faint light across his face, and she was struck again by the strange doubling of it. The face she knew in the mirror, aged differently, shaped differently by different years. How did it end, he said. In your timeline after the First War. She was quiet for a moment. We sent them a message, she said. On every frequency we could produce. In 17 languages, including 3 we invented for the purpose. We sent them mathematics. We sent them music. We sent them an accounting of everything we'd lost and everything we still had. And we sent them something that took them 2 years to translate. She paused. It was a joke. Jordan blinked. Joke. A very long, structurally complex, linguistically dense joke. It took our best linguists 6 months to encode it in a format they could receive, and then another 6 months to encode the context they'd need to understand it. We sent it because someone, I don't know who, it was before my service. Someone figured out that a species capable of sophisticated humor was a species too structurally complex to absorb. You can't incorporate something you can't predict. You can't predict something that can make you laugh at itself. She watched the sense returns. They retreated. They've never come back to our system. Jordan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What was the joke?" She told him. He started laughing. It was not a polite laugh, or a diplomatic laugh, or a "this is apparently what the situation calls for" laugh. It was a real one, surprised out of him, and it went on for longer than she expected. And when it wound down, he was shaking his head slowly and he said, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." "I know." And it worked. It worked. He looked at the sensors. He looked at the coffee. He picked it up and drank the cold dregs. "I need a different approach for this timeline," he said. "We don't have 6 months. No. But the principle's the same." He set down the cup. "Make them realize they can't solve us." "Yes, with Elroy's calibrator. And your relay." He nodded slowly. He was already thinking through it. She could see that. Could see the particular quality of attention that meant he was breaking a problem into components and assigning them. It was very familiar. It was, she realized, how she looked when she did the same thing, the same gesture, the same precise, quiet intensity. Some things branched in timelines and some things didn't. 7 hours, he said, glancing at the returns. "Then we'd better get started," she said. The relay was beautiful in the way that purely functional things can be beautiful. Not designed for beauty, not aware of it, but beautiful as a byproduct of being exactly what it needed to be. Jordan built it in 5 hours from components he'd been accumulating. For reasons he'd only partially understood at the time. The way people accumulate things, holding onto a piece because something in them recognized a future use that conscious thought hadn't articulated yet. The housing was machined aluminum. The receiver array was modified from the sensor rig. The transmission line was 300 meters of copper wire wound by hand. He placed it himself. Before dawn, with the sky still dark and the fleet's approach vectors visible on the sensor returns, he drove out to the approach corridor coordinates that Elroy had calculated, and he went out on foot the last 2 kilometers, because the terrain was too rough for the vehicle, and he placed the relay at the top of a rock formation with a clear sight line to the east, and he anchored it, and he ran the transmission line back toward the settlement. And then he sat down on the rock in the dark and watched the sky. She found him there when she came with the connection housing. She hadn't asked where he was. She'd known. "Fleet's at 900,000 kilometers, she said. "I know." He took the housing from her and connected it. "Elroy's ready?" "He was ready 2 hours ago. He's been rechecking his math." "Of course he has." A small sound, not quite a laugh. "He does that. Solves the problem, and then checks his work 6 times, because he doesn't trust his own solutions." "Where does he get that from?" Jordan looked at her. Even in the dark, she could see the expression on his face. The slight lift at the corner of the mouth, the specific amusement of a person who knows exactly where that comes from and is choosing not to say so. She felt the relay come online in her teeth. A faint vibration in the air, not quite audible, felt rather than heard, as the receiver array began drawing power and orienting. It was a sensitive instrument. Jordan had built it to be sensitive. The full drive emissions the Venlari would produce on final approach were powerful but brief, microsecond pulses at the moment of fold completion. And the relay would need to catch them and transmit them before the field dissipated. The sky began to change, not dramatically. Not with the thunder and fire of the stories she'd told recruits in other contexts, in other timings. It was subtle. A shimmer at the edge of perception. A faint warping of the stars in the eastern quadrant. The way heat makes distant air move. Then the shimmer resolved into something more definite. Lights, moving in formation, the flat, geometric spacing of ships that are following a programmed approach, rather than navigating by feel. "There they are," Jordan said quietly. The Venlari assessment fleet was 11 ships. In the orbital photographs Dara had seen in her timeline's archives, the images that had become icons of a war. They looked clean and functional and impossibly advanced, built in shapes that had no relationship to humans' engineering principles, because they had been developed by minds that thought differently, that had never had to deal with gravity or weather, or the particular engineering constraints of building things for beings who needed air and water, and warmth to stay alive. In person, in the amber pre-dawn sky of a valley, 38 years in one branch timeline from everything she'd known, they were extraordinary. "Elroy," she said into the communicator. Receiving the fold emissions now, his voice came back. Even over the radio. Even at 12 years old, in the middle of the most consequential moment of this world's history, he sounded focused. Calibration lock in 40 seconds. Copy. The ships were close enough now that she could see their running lights. Not lights exactly, more a kind of structured luminescence. Patterns in the hull material that shifted and moved with a rhythm that was almost biological. The Venlari communicated through light patterns at range. What the fleet was saying to the settlement, to the valley, to the world. In that shifting light, she knew what it was saying. She had translated it before, in the briefing rooms of her own timeline. It said, in the Venlari equivalent of a simple declared sentence, "We have assessed you. We have reached a conclusion." 30 seconds, Elroy said. The lead ship was enormous. It was big enough that it subtended a visible angle even at distance. A dark mass against the stars, with the shifting light patterns cascading across its hull in complex sequences. It was coming in on a shallow angle, not a combat approach. The Venlari didn't need a combat approach for an expression. They needed a demonstration approach. Something visible, something that made the statement clear. 30 seconds. She was aware of Jordan beside her. She was aware of the rock beneath her feet, and the transmission line running back toward the settlement, and the people there who were watching the same sky. She was aware of the smell of the valley, iron and wet stone and something old, and of the coffee going cold somewhere back in the workshop, and of Elroy with his lamp and his flour sack schematic, and his 7 checks of a problem he'd already solved. 10 seconds. When it fires, she said to Jordan, "You'll see the lead ship phase. It'll look like it's in 2 places at once for about a half second. What do we do when it happens?" "Nothing," she said. "Just watch." And they watch us watching. That's it. They need to see it register. They need to see that we knew what it was. That's the evidence. That's the proof. 5 seconds, Elroy said. 4, 2. The world held its breath. The lead Venlari ship phased. It was exactly as she'd described it, and also nothing like she'd described it, because descriptions were sounds and light, and this was real, unmediated, happening in the actual present tense of her actual body, standing on an actual rock in the dark. The ship seemed to fold into itself for a fraction of a second. Its outlines smearing, doubling, the light patterns on its hull stuttering and resetting. And in that moment, through the transmission line, through Jordan's relay, through Elroy's modified calibrator, the fold drive emissions of an alien vessel, 11 years ahead of any technology this world had ever produced, were caught and processed and fed into a quadrupotent inversion array built by a child in a valley who had taught himself physics from scratch and wanted to understand how things worked. The calibration field fired. She felt it as a pressure change. A brief, intense drop in atmospheric pressure, followed by a resonant vibration in the bones that she recognized from 2 prior exposure events in her own timeline. The crystal array in Elroy's calibrator absorbed the temporal displacement, corrected the inversion, created the phase differential she'd described. Approximately 4 seconds, the Venlari fleet, all 11 ships, shifted forward in time by 1.37 seconds. 1.37 seconds. Less time than it takes to blink twice. An interval so small as to be tactically meaningless. An interval that was, in the metrics of stellar warfare and imperial assessment, and the cold mathematics of which species survived, and which did not, effectively 0. An interval that proved, irrefutably, that the beings standing on this rock, in a valley on this small backwater world, had acquired working knowledge of Venlari full drive mechanics during the Venlari's own approach. The shift returned. The fleet was back in present time, the phase differential resolved. The ships hung in the sky, motionless, their light patterns suddenly stilled. Elroy's voice came over the radio. It was very quiet. "Did it work?" "Yes," Dara said. "I mean, did it work the other way? Did they?" "Yes." A pause. Then, with the particular steadiness of someone who has run a very long calculation and arrived at the correct answer, "Okay." The Venlari fleet did not fire. It did not perform the expression. It hung in the sky with its patterns stilled for 47 minutes. She timed it, standing on the rock with Jordan, watching, and then it began to move. Not inward, outward. A slow, deliberate withdrawal, the formation compressing, and then extending again into the wide assessment array, the approach vectors gone. In Venlari tactical doctrine, she knew There was a phase that came after the assessment phase and the expression phase. It did not have a clean translation. The closest rendering in any human language she'd worked with was re-evaluation of known parameters in light of new data. It was a phase the Venlari almost never entered in encounters with new species. New species almost never produced new data at the assessment moment. This one had. The light patterns on the hull of the lead ship changed. She had seen this before in recordings, and she watched it happen in real time with the steady attention of someone who knows what she is witnessing. Patterns shifted from the assessment register, the declarative, the conclusion statement, the "we have decided," to something else. Something that, in the recordings, she had always described to recruits as questioning, because that was the closest word, though it was not quite right. What it was in the Venlari register that did not translate cleanly. "Tell us more. Jordan," she said. "You see it. You need to answer them." He turned to look at her. "Don't know their language. They're in re-evaluation. They'll accept any register, any format." She looked at him. "Say something true." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ship, the enormous dark mass of it against the pre-dawn sky, its hull light shifting and waiting. He looked at the transmission line running back toward the valley. He looked at his hands. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and he brought out a radio transceiver. The old kind, amplitude modulated, the kind that worked whether or not anything sophisticated was functional. And he held the button, and he said, into the sky toward the fleet, in a clear voice that did not shake. "My son built a machine in a workshop in a valley. Oh, because he wanted to understand how things worked. He's 12 years old. He's never had a formal physics education. He figured out your fold drive from first principles and a used power cell and 3 weeks of work. I'm not telling you that to impress you. I'm telling you that because I think you should understand what you're dealing with before you make any decisions you can't take back." He released the button. The sky was quiet. The light patterns on the lead ship shifted again. She watched them and did not say what she was reading, because it wasn't her moment to translate. On the radio, Elroy's voice, "Dad, yeah, I can hear you from here." The relay picks up the transceiver. "I know what you said." A pause. "Was that for them or for me?" Jordan looked at the sky. Shh. The patterns were still shifting, still reading, and she was watching them, and her expression was the expression of someone seeing something turn out the way they had hoped, but had not allowed themselves to believe. He said, "Is that all right?" "Yeah," Elroy said. "That's all right." The fleet began its withdrawal at 0614 local time. It was not a retreat. The Venlari did not technically retreat. It was a repositioning, a formal adjustment of posture, and if you knew what you were looking at, it was actually something rarer than a retreat. Something she had seen only once before in her entire career and had not expected to see again. It was deference. The kind of deference that one complex thing shows to another when it has realized, somewhat to its own surprise, that it has encountered a peer. She stood on the rock until the last ship was out of visual range. Then she sat down, which was not something she generally did in operational situations. But her knees seemed to have made the decision without consulting her, and she decided not to argue with them. Jordan sat down too. He didn't say anything, neither did she. There was a long quiet in which the sky went from dark to the deep amber of this world's particular dawn, and the valley below them came visible in pieces. The water, the trees, the settlement, the lights, coming on as people woke to a day that was going to be different from all the days before it. She thought about the joke, the one she'd told him, the one that had ended a war in her timeline, encoded in 17 languages by linguists who'd worked 6 months to make it legible to a species that had never encountered the concept of something being funny. She thought about what the joke meant. Not the punchline, but the thing underneath the punchline, the thing that the Venlari had taken 2 years to understand, and then had found, apparently, disturbing enough to withdraw from the entire system. The joke was about a species that found its own situation absurd and kept going anyway. The joke was about what it meant to be simultaneously aware of how small you were and unwilling to act like it. The joke was, in the end, about exactly what had happened in this valley in the last 24 hours. A 12-year-old with a flour sack schematic and a used power cell, an inversion that shouldn't have worked. A woman falling out of the future, onto her back in the wrong-colored dawn. And 3,000 people watching 11 ships decide that maybe they didn't have the whole picture after all. You should go back, Jordan said. Yes, Elroy will have the calibrator fully functional within the hour. He'll have found the thing we couldn't figure out and fixed it, and he'll call it a minor adjustment. He probably will. When you go back. He stopped. What happens to this timeline? It continues, she said. It doesn't close. You made a different choice 20 years ago than I did. The branch is real. The divergence is real. This timeline keeps going. You keep going. Will there be another fleet? Not from the Venlari. They entered re-evaluation tonight. That's not a small thing for them. They don't do that often. By the time they reach a new conclusion, Elroy will be 40. He'll have built things you can't imagine. She paused. There will be other fleets, other species, other moments like this one. He nodded. He was looking at the valley. You'll be ready, she said. How do you know? She looked at him. She looked at the face that was her face differently shaped. The hands she might have had if she'd made different choices. The man who had grown vegetables and fixed things and built a sensor array and produced a child who taught himself physics from first principles and wanted, genuinely, to understand how things worked. 'Cause you've always been ready, she said. You just didn't know what you were ready for. The calibrator was fully functional at 0742. The adjustment, as predicted, was minor, a correct winding tension in the resonance coil that Elroy had dismissed as a secondary variable, and then, upon re-examination, recognized as primary. He made the adjustment without drama, and announced it was done the way he announced most things, with a kind of matter-of-fact satisfaction that was exactly her satisfaction, and nothing like her satisfaction, which was the strangest thing she had experienced in a stranger-than-usual week. The activation sequence was simple. Stand in the displacement field. Hold the crystal array. Initiate the calibration pulse. She stood in the displacement field. Elroy handed her the crystal array. She held it. Hey, she said. He looked up at her, 12 years old. Nose, Jordan's hands, physics from first principles, and a used power cell. Keep checking your work, she said. Even when you're sure. Especially when you're sure. He nodded. I know. Also, she paused. The quadripotent array. When you rebuild the Mark IV, use a radial winding on the secondary coil instead of a linear. It'll give you a stability margin you don't have now. He blinked. How do you know about radial winding? Same way you know about quadripotent arrays, she said. Figured it out. He smiled. It was a small smile. Private, not performed, and it was the most familiar thing had seen in this timeline. It was the smile she'd had at 12. The one she'd mostly learned to suppress over 38 years of professional necessity. The one that meant I like this problem and I'm going to solve it, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it. She thought, he's going to be extraordinary. She thought he already is. Jordan activated the calibration pulse. The valley disappeared. In the operational log she filed 6 weeks later, upon return to Venlari Station in her own timeline, she described the event in the standard format. Anomalous temporal displacement event. Cause under investigation. No tactical casualties. Mission parameters unaffected. She described the Venlari re-evaluation in the technical register. She described the full drive exploitation in the technical register. She did not describe Elroy. She did not describe the coffee, the ultrasonic rig, the workshop with everything in its place, the relay built from components accumulated without knowing why. Those things were not in the report. They were in something else. Something she was still working out how to say. In what language? To whom? The joke had ended a war in her timeline. Something simpler had done it. Something quieter. A father's voice in the dark, carrying over a radio transceiver to 11 ships hanging in an amber sky, saying, I think you should understand what you're dealing with. And 11 ships, which had never before paused to reconsider. Pausing to reconsider. She thought about that for a long time afterward. She thought about what it meant that the Venlari, a species 4 centuries and 11 civilizations into their particular project, had looked at a valley and a child and a piece of wire and a used power cell and decided they needed more information. She thought about what it said about them, about what they were still capable of somewhere under the assessment doctrine and the fold drives. and the 400 years of being the most powerful thing in their part of the galaxy. Maybe everyone was capable of it, she thought. The reevaluation, the pause, the willingness to say, I thought I knew what I was looking at, and I was wrong. And that's interesting. Maybe that was the thing the Venlari had been trying to assess all along, not whether humans were powerful, not whether they were sophisticated, not whether their civilizations were stable under stress. Maybe what the Venlari had been trying to find out, across 11 species and 4 centuries, was whether they would ever meet anyone capable of surprising them. They had their answer now. She filed the report. She closed the log. She went to the window of the station and looked out at the stars, at the outer belt where the fleet had been, and wasn't anymore, at the long dark distances between things. Somewhere in a branched timeline, in a valley with amber light and iron-tasting air, a boy was already building the Mark IV. She knew without any uncertainty, the kind of certainty you can't justify but don't need to, the kind that lives in the bones, that it was going to work.